Welcome back, and thank you so much for staying with us here on SA Today. Now, the United Nations Security Council is currently holding a debate on women, peace and security. We take you live now to the United Nations headquarters.
Georgia, Germany, Ghana, Guatemala, Hungary, India, Indonesia, Islamic Republic of Iran, Ireland, Italy, Israel, Japan, Jordan, Kenya, Lebanon, Liberia, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Maldives, Malta, Mexico, Montenegro, Morocco, Namibia, Nepal, New Zealand, Norway, Pakistan, Paraguay, the Philippines, Portugal, Qatar, the Republic of Korea, Romania, Rwanda, Slovakia, Slovenia, Sri Lanka, Switzerland, Thailand, Trinidad and Tobago, Turkey, Ukraine, the United Arab Emirates, Uruguay, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and Vietnam to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Phumzile Mlambo Nguka, Executive Director of the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, and Ms. Randa Signora Atala, General Director of the Women's Center for Legal Aid and Counseling. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite the following to participate in this meeting. Her Excellency Ms. Mara Marinaki, Principal Advisor for Gender and the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace and Security of the European External Action Service of the European Union. Ms. Narja Saidane, Permanent Observer of the Organisation Internationale de Francophonie to the United Nations. Ms. Amana Sana Darisuran, OSC Senior Advisor on Gender Issues, and Ms. Claire Hutchinson, Special Representative of NATO Secretary General for Women, Peace and Security. I propose that the Council invite the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of the Holy See to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2018/900, the report of the Secretary General on Women and Peace and Security. I wish to also draw the attention of Council members to document S/2018/904, a letter dated 9 October 2018 from the Permanent Representative of the Plurinational State of Bolivia to the United Nations addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I wish to warmly welcome the Secretary General, His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, and give him the floor.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to thank the Bolivian Presidency for giving us the opportunity of dealing with the implementation of the Agenda on Women, Peace and Security through the political and economic empowerment of women. I congratulate the Council for their efforts this past year, increasing briefers from civil society to the Security Council, the work of their group of experts on women, peace and security, and achieving gender parity and guaranteeing the gender perspective amongst briefers during some of the presidencies of their members. Never over the course of the past 30 years has the number of countries subject to violent conflict being as high as now. Forced displacements due to war and persecution are more numerous than ever. Climate change and underdevelopment threaten our security increasingly. Human rights are relegated to the second level. There is place for concern, but we must resist pessimism around us and not lose sight of the existing solutions. Hope has always guided our path in the action we take collectively for women, peace and security. It is an issue that bears change with it. It has many elements which we need in order to respond to the complex challenges which the world must face: climate change, disarmament, equality and inclusion. It is also an essential issue for our main goal, preventing conflict and human suffering.
Over the past year, we have seen positive examples of progress. Women's organizations continue to make an impact, from keeping dialogue alive in Guinea-Bissau to rebuilding communities in Colombia. In the Central African Republic and Mali, women successfully contributed to negotiating between armed actors to halt the escalation of intercommunal tensions. In the Syrian Arab Republic, women have negotiated local ceasefires, mediated the creation of civilian safe zones, and coordinated humanitarian and relief initiatives. Similarly, in Yemen. And I can personally attest to the critical importance of the work done by the women peacemakers I have met around the world, from Mali to Bangladesh. Here at the United Nations, the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund is channeling resources to women's organizations that need them. The Peacebuilding Fund invests more than 30% of its resources in gender equality programming, and the growing number of donors and earmarking funds for gender equality is taking place. We are placing this agenda at the heart of our partnerships with regional organizations. The Deputy Secretary General has made several high-level missions with the AU focused on women, peace and security and development. And last month, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Dr. Denis Mukwege and Nadia Muradi, two champions of women, peace and security, who exemplify the power of individuals to make a difference and the fact that survivors and advocates are best placed to determine the changes needed to build sustainable peace. But despite this progress in some areas, the facts on the ground show that we still have far to go. The participation of women in formal peace processes remain extremely limited. Between 1990 and 2017, women constituted just 2% of mediators, 8% of negotiators, and 5% of witnesses and signatories in all major peace processes. Conflict continues to have a devastating effect on women and girls. The United Nations documented more than 800 cases of conflict-related sexual violence in 2017, a 56% increase since 2016. Women human rights defenders, political leaders, journalists and activists who play an important role in addressing the root causes of conflict are targeted at alarming rates. Women's marginalization, lack of access to health and education services, and economic disempowerment continue to be both a cause and an effect of conflict. And funding for programs to promote gender equality and the empowerment of women in countries affected by conflict is just 5% of total bilateral aid to such countries. Mr. President, the evidence linking gender equality and peace was recently set out in our joint study with the World Bank, Pathways for Peace. It is convincing and well known. Maybe that is why the list of speakers for this debate is so long every year. And in 2015, this open debate had the highest number of speakers of the history of the Security Council. But there is a significant gap between what we say in this chamber and what we do outside it. Every year we make laudable commitments, but they are not backed with the requisite financial and political support. We repeat statistics about the sustainability of inclusive peace processes, but that is not how we mediate most conflicts. We extol the positive influence of women peace builders, but provide little space for their participation. We rely heavily on women's organizations, but do not fund them adequately. We recognize the importance of gender analysis, but cut the budgets for such expertise. To address this gap, I intend to prioritize several action points in the coming year. First, gender parity has the greatest potential impact on effectiveness and credibility in our field operations. But it is where the numbers are lowest and the rate of change is slowest. Women now comprise 41% of heads and deputy heads of our peace operations, more than ever before. Their different perspectives are already having a positive impact. But the number of women in peace operations overall has stagnated. Without decisive action, they will go backwards as some missions are downsized. I have therefore formed a working group to put emergency measures in place to address this. Some elements will need approval from member states, and I hope your commitment here today will be reflected.
All right, it looks like we've lost the link to the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who's basically, addressing the issues around women, peace and security. And this, of course, happening at the United Nations headquarters in New York, where Mr. Guterres is basically saying that progress has been seen in the past years where women's role have actually been recognized, and he can attest to the great work that's been done by women peacekeepers around the world, mentioning some of those countries, of course. And he says that the participation of women in peace processes is still not satisfactory. It's still worrying, and empowerment of women in conflict areas as well is still very low. So he was basically saying that they need to address that particular issue of the representation of women, and saying that they will have to engage all the member states on this particular issue to see what can be done in terms of addressing the gender parity that's happening. So that is what the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres was basically saying. And we are also expecting to hear from Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. Of course, she's the Executive Director for Women, and would have to hear what she's got to say regarding the issues around women, peace and security. It looks like everything is back to normal now. Let us go back to the United Nations headquarters in New York.
Networks. Women's participation should not be confined to advisory roles or parallel structures, and I welcome the growing sense of urgency from member states, civil society and others to ensure that we are designing more effective peace processes with much stronger participation of women. Third, a gendered approach to peace and security means supporting peace building at the local level, even during conflict. As peace processes falter at the national and international level, we must consistently support the local women's group that negotiate humanitarian access and support community resilience, learn from them, and build peace from the ground up. Fourth, financing this agenda is critical, and the UN intends to lead by example. I have created a high-level task force to review our funding on gender equality, including in the peace and security pillar. And I will hold UN entities accountable to their commitments to track spending on women, peace and security, with a target of reaching or exceeding 15% by 2020. Finally, from now on, I will include gender analysis in my reports to this Council whenever it is relevant to inform your decisions. Mr. President, in 2 years' time, we will mark the 20th anniversary of the Security Council Resolution 1325, the 5th anniversary of the Global Agreement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration. Gender equality and women's participation are a unifying thread running through the implementation of these landmark agreements for human rights, sustainable development, and peace and security. In preparation for these, my report on women, peace and security next year will include an assessment of implementation of the relevant recommendations in the 3 peace and security reviews undertaken in 2015, particularly the global study on implementation of Security Council Resolution 1325 and Security Council Resolution 2242 adopted that year. The findings and recommendations from this assessment will be the basis for increased efforts in the year leading up to 2020. And I encourage Member States to initiate similar preparations and reviews. As we look forward, I urge you to invest in gender equality and women's empowerment, not only as an end in themselves, but as critical means of achieving our overarching aim of preventing and ending conflict and building peace and prosperity in the world for all. Thank you very much.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing and, above all, for the leadership that he is giving us in this area and in others. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Phumzile Mlambo Nguka.
Secretary General, Mr. President, distinguished delegates, it's an honor to address the Security Council and to speak on the Secretary General's report on women, peace and security. Thank you to Bolivia for all the support they have given us in preparing for this debate. Excellencies, this report is a loud alarm bell on systemic failures to bring women into peacemaking in a meaningful manner. The trend is women are being excluded from the peace processes. The ones who do not wage war seem to be disqualified from making the peace, while those who may be implicated in making the war tend to find it easy to be at the peace table. I, together with DPKO, have just come back from a joint UN-AU mission to South Sudan. The women we met there told us that they long for peace and to resume their lives. There are nearly 5 years of suffering from a civil war that they kept on repeating they were not responsible for waging was taking a toll on them. And they said, we are here because we want to reconcile, even though we have never quarreled. While they'll still fear for the future, they appreciated the revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict, which offers new hope for the country and an unmissable opportunity to build peace, with a 35% quota for the representation of women. Their fears are, however, bolstered by the fact that in these early days of the revitalized agreement, in the National Pre-Transitional Committee, there's just one woman amongst 10 persons nominated to be members of the committee, which is not the agreed 35%. The report today details inescapably how this is not an exception but the rule, how there is at the same time hope for progress, but how we are failing to make this hope a reality, but hope we can never and must not lose. It shows us an undeniable possibility with undeniable failures, which are costing the lives of women and girls who, as we said, suffer and die from a war they are not waging. Mr. President, a year ago in this chamber, I raised the alarm at the numbers shown by the indicators we track year on year on peace process and mediation. Today, I want to raise the alarm once more with the hope that it will jolt us into greater actions. Indicators show that we have stagnated or dropped again. For that reason, we have focused this year's report on the need for women's meaningful contribution to peace, and we call on all of us to make sure that we take the much-needed concrete actions. We need you to be vigilant about the ending of superficial efforts to include women that do not genuinely extend the opportunity to influence outcome. We also want to show that the extreme political marginalization at peace table is often worse in institutions that are set up to implement these agreements. And we want to spotlight the many ways in which women keep on being active and resilient. Women in the front lines are negotiating ceasefires, civilian safe zones, demobilizing of fighters, or humanitarian access at the local level. They are drawing up protection plans at the community level, like in Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, or in the Central African Republic. We want the UN membership to pay due attention to these dynamics and make them visible in forums like this one, and use them to support the women's political agency, provide financial resource, and to enable women to do even more. The continued tolerance for the limited recognition of women's expertise and lived experience is a setback for all of us. Statistics on women's involvement speak for themselves. On these issues, the report offers more numbers. Between 1990 and 2017, under our watch, women constituted only 2% of mediators, 8% of negotiators, and 5% of witnesses and signatories in major peace processes. Only 3 out of 11 agreements signed in 2017 contained provisions on gender equality, continuing last year's worrisome downward trend. Of 1,500 agreements signed between 2000 and 2016, only 25% raised the role of women's engagement in the implementation phase. In Yemen, current efforts at resuming dialogue do not include women beyond setting up observer bodies to advise the UN Special Envoy. Even in a consultative meeting in London this summer, organized by the UN, convening 22 prominent Yemeni leaders to discuss the peace talks, there were only 3 Yemeni women invited. In Mali, women average a dismal 3% on the membership of the multiple national committees set up to monitor and implement the peace agreement. In Central African Republic, mediation efforts are focused on the presidency of the 14 armed groups. They also exclude women altogether. In Afghanistan, the government and its international partners invest efforts in including women in the High Peace Council and Provincial Peace Council. But when it came to the actual talk with the Taliban, women's absence is noticeable. Undeniably, there are possibilities, but undeniably, there are also failures, and there are also determined women. In the 23 rounds of Afghanistan-Taliban peace talks between 2005 and 2014, women were at the table just twice. Now that there are offers to resume peace talks without preconditions, Afghan women peace builders want to be at the table and they want to make a difference. Finally, there's a number that is positive. Security Council decisions about country-specific or regional situations that contain language on women, peace and security increased from 15% to 75%, and this must lead to increased action on the front lines. The number of women leaders and civil society representatives who briefed the Security Council also increased significantly, and I thank the Council members for these efforts and their continued participation in the informal expert group on women, peace and security, currently co-chaired by Sweden, Peru, in collaboration with the United Kingdom. But we need to use all available diplomatic channels and the political influence to ensure that these decisions in New York are making a difference on the ground, because this is simply not happening in the most meaningful way. The bigger picture of gender inequality in conflict and post-conflict countries is something we need to continue to watch. Today's report gives us a broad picture of the many remaining areas of challenge to reach equal representation on women in the vital process of our nations. For example, only 6% of the parliamentarians in conflict and post-conflict countries are women, same as last year and the year before. There is 20% representation of women in countries that use quotas and just 12% in countries that do not use quotas. It is for that reason that we appreciate the leading from the front demonstrated by our Secretary General and call for special measures in the manner in which we are driving the parity process within the United Nations. This Council just visited the Democratic Republic of Congo ahead of crucial elections. Only 12% of registered candidates are women, just like in the previous election 7 years ago, and women are suffering from intimidation. On the 17 countries that have elected women head of state or government, none are post-conflict countries at this point. I ask again, as I did last year, we need to heed the call and address the patterns these numbers show us. On our part, we will continue to follow up with you on how we can together address the situation with more vigilance and make significant difference. It is not only women whose opportunities are being limited.
All right, it seems like we've lost that link to the United Nations. That's the Executive Director of the United Nations Women, Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, of course, weighing in on the debate on women, peace and security. Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka basically saying that there is a trend that she's observed that women are generally being excluded in the peace processes. And she just came back from South Sudan. She met women where they were basically indicating their desire to, be involved in peace processes and reconcile, even though they were never part of conflicts. Let's just take you back to the United Nations and hear what she's got to say.
Who die every day from causes related to pregnancy and childbirth. 507 die in countries that are considered fragile because of conflict and disaster. To address these issues and support the regeneration of families and communities, we need strong targeted investment in women in conflict areas. This is just not happening enough, despite undeniable goodwill towards women, peace and security agendas in countries that are affected by conflict. This clear gender inequality in women's access to resources is not simply caused by presence of conflict. It is also a reflection of non-prioritization of women's needs and the relegation of women to small-scale and local peripheral initiatives. In the Sahel, where we visited with the Deputy Secretary General and the AU and Minister Wallstrom, we saw the dire poverty of the women and community in the Lake Chad Basin. We saw households with no electricity in a part of the world which has the highest penetration of the sun on Earth and is more suitable than anywhere else in the world for sustainable energy generation from solar. Yet, clinics lack power. Women have no cold storage for their fish and fresh produce needed for food security, which contributes to peace and security, even in some cases more than what the military can do. In conflict-affected countries, only 11.5% of landholders are women. Although bilateral aid to promote gender equality in fragile country situations rose by 17% compared to the previous year, it is still only amounts to 5% of total bilateral aid spent on programs with gender equality as the primary objectives. In the DRC, for example, aid from OECD DAC to gender equality was only $8 per capita last year. The same year, the UN documented a 56% increase in sexual violence. This share of aid channeled through non-governmental women's organizations has stagnated. Our financial commitments just do not match the extent to which we rely on these groups. Yet, there has been undeniable progress because the numbers of actions and collaboration that is intended with civil society keeps on being favored as a way to operate. But this must also turn into concrete action and better investment on these groups. Civil society and women's organizations have been failed in the midst of record-breaking numbers of side events at intergovernmental meetings. Our plea is to refocus our energies and resources. I believe there is goodwill, and we all want what is best for women and girls. While we have disappointing indicators on women and girls, global military spending has reached $1.74 trillion, a 57% increase since 2000. Some countries allocate more public money to the military than to education or health. 90% of grassroots women's organizations working in these areas directly impacted by terrorism and violent extremism state that current counterterrorism measures have adverse impact on the work for peace, women's rights, and gender equality. We must respond to the many violations, the human rights of women and girls within these groups, and to the social stigma, economic hardship, and discrimination women and girls experience when returning to their homes and communities when they have been part of the violent groups. These challenges are best addressed by actions that protect and promote the rights of victims and are fundamentally based in human rights law. Women human rights defenders are on the front line and are fighting a lonely battle. Many die a lonely death from weapons that are meant to protect them. Mr. President, let us look ahead with hope and the knowledge of what we are capable of doing together. This includes what we can do with women, such as the African Women Leadership Network that has been given a boost by the support of the German government, and the focal points have already been established in 30 African countries. We are already gearing up for the 20th anniversary of 1325, which will be an opportunity to shape the agenda for the next decade with new commitments and priorities. We have to start now to gear up for better results. We need more positive signs, such as those I saw in Somalia, where we need to help to accelerate the positive change. There will be opportunities for everyone to weigh in, including the next year's meeting of Women, Peace and Security Focal Points Network in Windhoek, Namibia, which will carry on a special symbolism for those that have been part of this movement for a while. For now, I want to share 3 priorities for 2020. This August, we would have mourned the loss of Kofi Annan. Part of his legacy was that the UN debated and decided to stop supporting peace agreements that included blanket amnesties. I think that 2 decades later, it is time for the UN to have a similar conversation about supporting, brokering, and paying for peace negotiations that exclude women. This is in your hands. This was raised by women from civil society at the forum this council was invited earlier to this week and at the initiative of Sweden. Secondly, one of the many positive examples in this report is the UN Peacebuilding Fund's steadily growing support to projects advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. Finding ways to make this 15% minimum target a reality across all relevant entities and other peace and security funds is, again, another important take that we can focus on going forward, such as joint programming on rule of law in conflict and post-conflict areas and addressing educational and economic resilience of women. Or multi-partner trust funds in federal settings should be at the start of all conversation about financing. And finally, we need to do much to protect women activists, peace builders, and human rights defenders in conflict-affected areas. We applaud the historic participation of Palestinian women presenting civil society in addressing this Security Council for the first time. We commend the Nobel Peace Prize Committee for recognizing Dr. Dennis Mukwege and Nadia Murad for their advocacy on behalf of victims of wartime sexual violence. It is an example of the importance of this issue to which my esteemed colleague, SRSG Pramila Patten, devotes all her time and energy. I meet many exceptional, courageous women in many recent travels in Somalia, South Sudan, and Sahel, and amongst the Rohingya women refugees, this was no exception. Many of them are here today, but many could not be here. In 2017, half of the women honored in the annual tribute of the Association for Women in Development were murdered in conflict-affected countries. But the list is much longer when we include women political leaders, journalists, justice actors, and security sectors, and those perceived to be LGBTQI or those who challenge traditional gender roles by simply being involved in public life. It is my strong wish that we will find political will to do much more about the epidemic of killing of women that we've seen over this closing decade. Change is within our hands. Let us work for positive indicators for the next report, and let us make sure that the next Secretary General's report will be able to show that we are turning the corner. Thank you.
All right, well, there you have it. That's Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. She is the Executive Director of the United Nations Women, of course, tabling that report in terms of how far the world has come for women, peace and security. Basically saying that, as I said earlier on, that she highlighted her concerns regarding the trend that women are being excluded in peacekeeping missions and peace processes. And she also indicated that she recently just came back from South Sudan, where she met a number of women there who indicated their willingness to participate in peace processes and also to reconcile, even though they were not part of the conflict themselves. So Dr. Mlambo-Ngcuka continued by saying that the report indicates that there is hope to progress, as much as that progress is not being experienced, but there is that little hope that things will eventually get better. She said the United Nations, or rather she wants the United Nations membership to pay specific attention to all the shortfalls that are highlighted in the report, and most importantly to provide support accordingly. The report this year focused on the need to look at women, peace and security, of course, and their inclusions in those missions. So she also made mention of the fact that between 1990 and 2017, according to a report, women only constituted 2% in mediation processes and only about 8% in negotiation processes. So she also gave a breakdown of women leaders at the Security Council and basically said that they will continue to follow up on this particular matter to make sure that it is addressed going forward. So that's basically what she said. And interestingly enough, this report, of course, or the debate happens at the time where Africa has actually seen its first female head of state, that of course happening in Ethiopia, where we've seen the election. Of course, this is a ceremonial position, that of the Prime Minister happening there, the first Africa's only female head of state at this particular moment. And during her address in Parliament, she specifically pledged to promote peace and security, saying that she will do this in the name of a mother who is the first to suffer from the absence of peace. So, of course, this goes hand in hand with what Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka was basically saying. She also indicated and also promised to work hard to make gender equality a reality in Ethiopia. So that's basically what came out of that debate, looking into issues around women, peace and security. It is 23 minutes before the top of the hour.